Welcome to Hey Tabi, the podcast where we talk about the hard things out loud with our actual lips. We'll cover all kinds of topics across the mental health spectrum, including how it intersects with the Christian faith. Nothing is off limits here, and we are not take two verses and call me in the morning. I'm Tabitha Westbrook, and I'm a licensed trauma therapist, but I'm not your trauma therapist. I'm an expert in domestic abuse and coercive control, and how complex trauma impacts our health and well-being. Our focus here is knowledge and healing. Trauma doesn't have to eat your lunch forever. There is hope. Now, let's get going. What happens when your deepest wounds are tied to your body, your faith, and your sexuality? The very things meant to give life, joy, and connection. Today, we're going to break the silence, and we are going to talk about sexual trauma in Christian spaces. We're going to talk about my new book, Body and Soul, Healed and Whole, an invitational guide to healthy sexuality after trauma, abuse, and coercive control. And I'm not by myself. I am with somebody pretty awesome, so I'm going to let her introduce herself.
My name is Colleen Ramser. I'm a good friend of Tabby's, and I'm really excited about her book. We both do very similar work, and so I was super excited to get to interview her on her podcast.
Was it Michael Scott said, "Oh, how the turntables have turned," or something? I don't know. That was a really bad quote from The Office. I butchered that badly.
I love The Office, but it has been overtaken by This Is Us now. That is my new favorite. Tell your listeners a little bit about your book, just to give them a little taste of what you've been doing for, gosh, how long has it been? Like what?
2 years.
2 years? Yeah. I've had the privilege of seeing the book baby in the belly. I've had the privilege of seeing it start to come alive to the point that it is now. So it's just been a great privilege to be able to do that. Tell me a little bit about the book.
So the book really is meant to be an invitational guide. So many women have had their sexuality just shattered, whether that was through childhood molestation, whether that was through some sort of assault or harm during teenagerdom, young adulthood, adulthood, or even in an abusive relationship. I don't know that many women get out of this earth without having some sort of sexual harm done. And a lot of Christian women just don't know what to do with that. And it's not really talked about in the church. So this truly is a very invitational, very embodied, very much not preachy, not to take two verses and call me in the morning book on healing. And first of all, understanding what happened and what happens to your body in that place, what happens to your soul, and then what an embodied healing looks like, and how to walk forward with an intact or completely new sexuality, or a sexuality in the first place when you're like, gosh, I didn't even have one, because bad things happened so young.
Right. I mean, this book is monumental, honestly, because there really isn't any language for this in the church. I've read your book, and it is like nobody is talking about this. I hear about it in my office as a therapist, and I hear women feeling like they don't know where to go. Like, how do I talk about some of this, what feels like shameful things that are coming up in my thoughts and in my body after I have experienced sexual assault or sexual abuse? So can you tell the listeners a little bit about what's some of the language that you really bring to light? Maybe a few of them that seem to be like non-existent in the church, or just talk a little bit about like how there is no language. What that's like.
It is really hard to have direct conversations, I think, about sex in the church, particularly if you're a woman. I think there are some places for men, maybe a little bit, but definitely not really for women. So we really start with some vocabulary in a lot of ways of words that are often overly sexualized, and then disentangling that from just purely sexual discussion, like arousal or sensuality. Those are words that are much bigger than just about sex, and they end up getting pigeonholed, and it's a shame because there's such goodness in them. And then just talking about the hard things directly out loud with our actual lips, and really giving people language around harm. What happened to you? What happens now because of what happened to you? So really talking about ways that we respond when we've been harmed, and helping women have a different way to say, oh my gosh, these are the words. These are the words that make sense. And I think that's been one of the most interesting things as people have read it, is I am hearing these are the words I needed to hear.
Yes.
Because I didn't know how to say what happened.
Right. And there's some listeners that are like blushing right now. They're like,
Mhm.
oh, you said this, you said that. But there's so many other women who are just like, gosh, just reduces a lot of the shame, helps them to feel like I'm not alone in this. There was a couple of areas too where you talked a little bit about purity culture, just how that relates and how everything it just causes people to recoil or cringe or blush or we can't talk about that. Tell us a little bit about purity culture and how that's impacted a lot of the work that you do with victims of sexual abuse and sexual assault.
Yeah, I think part of the reason people blush is because of purity culture. We have
Mhm.
been told we aren't allowed to utter these words, which is
Right.
just not truth. There's nowhere in the Bible that says thou shalt not talk about sex. In
Right.
fact, the Bible itself talks about it quite a bit. It talks about
Right.
morality in terms of that. It talks about healthy sexuality in places, which I don't think people often realize.
Hmm.
And so purity culture kind of messed that up for us. And I think it started off well. I'm sure that it was well
Right.
intended, but it was
Right.
not well executed, much like the Pharisees. And so
Right.
adding rules and regulations and things like that actually only served to allow for abuse. So by saying that women are the arbiters of men's sexuality, then you
Mm.
say that women are essentially an object and we're responsible for someone else's heart and sin, which is not what God says. But when you're
Mm.
in that place, then you're like, well, I'm not allowed to talk about it. I'm not supposed to think about sex until I am married. And then I'm supposed to think about it as often as my spouse thinks about
Mm.
it and
Hmm.
do it as often as my spouse says that they want to do it. And then what do you do if you're single and you have feelings? And the church doesn't even talk about that because if you're single, you're not
Right.
supposed to have feelings, but that is
Right.
also not how we're created. So
Right.
really putting aside things that are not of the Lord and being able to say we can have an absolutely God honoring discussion that is
Hmm.
frank and direct about sex for women
Hmm.
and being very safe in those spaces and also not demeaning men in those spaces. There are destructive men. I mean, that is a big portion of what I do. And there is harmful things that have happened,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
not all men are that way. And if we
Right.
reduce all men down to their sexuality, then we have done them a disservice. But I'm also not minimizing harm either. You know, there
Right.
are men who have taken the mantle from purity culture that says once you're married, your wife will be your absolute sexual everything. And they have a distortion because it's pornified,
Hmm.
right? It
Hmm.
really, the way that that's languaged to young men very often is she'll be your personal porn star. First of all, pornography is immoral and it is not helpful. It is adultery. Second, also,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
is not what a
Yep.
woman's role is. That's not what the Lord calls her. That is not how the Lord speaks of women. And
Hmm.
so you've then put this thing on a woman that opens up the ability to be abused because if she's supposed to be your everything, and then we've distorted scripture like submission and things like that, then we are opening things up to stuff like marital rape.
Yeah.
And I know for some people you went when I
Oh,
said
I
that.
want to go there. I definitely that
Mhm.
was gonna be the next. It's got purity culture, which is like on one side of the spectrum, which is very don't do this, don't do this, don't say that, don't say that. You know, keep yourself, don't kiss, don't, you know, everybody has their personal convictions when it comes to, you know, touch and things like that. But then you have the other end of the spectrum when you get married, it's like this, your body is mine sexually. And can you open up to the listeners a little bit more on what's in your book, which is just priceless, really talking about marriage and how this stuff can show up in marriage, which I know for some people are like, what? And other people are like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I've been thinking and feeling.
Yeah. So in the book Body and Soul Healed and Whole, one of the things that I really do look at is disentangling the spiritual abuse that often is present as well. My
Mhm.
definition of spiritual abuse is taking someone's good and right devotion to God and using it against them, weaponizing it. And so they'll take scriptures like those in Ephesians about submission,
Mhm.
First Corinthians about sex and bodies and all of those things, and use only part of them, which is really terrible hermeneutics, frankly, and say, well, you know, you must submit to me. But the Bible doesn't say we submit in all things. First, we submit to Jesus, then we submit to each other. And submission is always voluntary. It is
Right,
never forced. When it becomes forced, it's subjugation. That's
right.
slavery. That's a whole different thing. And also
Hmm.
not okay with Jesus. And, that First Corinthians scripture, well, your body belongs to me. Yes, and your body belongs to me. It was a game changer in the ancient world because women didn't ever hear that. And Jesus
Yeah,
said, this is how this works. And
right.
so that means that I could say to my spouse, I don't want your body on my body.
Yeah, I had heard you say that once, and I was like, yes.
Mhm.
Because it really is almost this mutual yielding instead of like mutual, like, give your whole self. It's this mutual sort of like yielding to the other in terms of, where are they? If your spouse is unable to do something sexually, or maybe they can't at that evening. I want to delve into that a little bit, just even peeling back the layer of what this more practically looks like. It's one thing to be disappointed that your spouse can't do something, maybe
Mhm.
because maybe they have a history of trauma and that they're not able to do something sexually because of something that was done to them. But there's a line,
Mhm.
like your spouse is not your just object to make do things. So can you
Mhm.
speak to that for people who maybe are in situations that don't know where that line is?
Yeah, we are not guaranteed sex. And when I say sex, I mean intercourse, right? And somehow along the way, we have decided this is the end all be all of the
Mm-hmm.
relationship. It is an aspect of a healthy
Mm-hmm.
relationship,
Mm.
but it is
Yeah,
not
that's good.
the aspect of intimacy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are so many other aspects of intimacy, and there are other aspects of touch that are not just intercourse and
Right.
are not just certain sexual touch. We can expand that and really look at intimacy in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you have someone who is unable or unwilling to do something because it is uncomfortable, it hits a trauma space, or maybe it's just like that's not their jam. We're actually allowed to have preferences in the bedroom. It's the
Right?
craziest thing.
Yes, in life
Wild.
in general.
Yes, we should be able to honor that for our
Right.
spouses. There are plenty of other things in an honoring, physically intimate relationship that can, in fact, be done. And
Mm-hmm.
that's an important aspect. What if your spouse got cancer and physically could not do something because of
Mm-hmm.
cancer treatment?
Mm-hmm.
Why would we vilify that and say, well, now I'm not getting what I need?
Mm-hmm.
Where
Mm-hmm.
is the understanding of intimacy and care and kindness and loving your wife's body like you love your own, which is actually in the Bible. And you're supposed
Mm-hmm.
to love your wife like you love your own body. And you're also supposed to love her like Christ loved the church and gave himself for her, which was death, by the way.
Right.
And those are things that are really important to remember.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
when you're honoring each other, because again, it's mutual, and you're honoring each other's limits, and men have sexual harm too. There
Mm-hmm.
may be something
Mm-hmm.
that a man can't do because of a physical issue or because of their own trauma, and that is okay as well. So, how are we entering in with each other
Mm-hmm.
and giving that care and that kindness and an
Yep.
invitation to more than just, as Sam Jolman puts it, the practice of sex and entering into the poetics where the heart is at?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like we've talked about this before. Like we really have a very low view of marriage and sex and how we view it. It's just objectification more than this really beautiful thing. So I'm curious, like now thinking about maybe listeners who have gone through this or even the single women. We didn't even touch on that. But what are some of the hopeful things that you offer in the book in terms of change? Someone's sitting there and they're like, "Oh my gosh, this is me." And now you've given language. Can you give the listeners a little bit more about like how you help them through this?
Yeah. So, understanding some of your body responses, some of your behavioral responses, even is such an important thing because it really is a tough space when you're like, I don't know why I am drawn to this thing or,
Hmm.
you know, terrified of this thing or completely
Hmm.
shut down or way more wide open than my values are going with, you
Right.
know,
Right.
to help folks understand how trauma impacts things like desire, things like our behavior
Hmm.
and take out the shame of it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now there are things that, just because it's permissible doesn't mean it's a good idea. That's Paul. And so
Right.
there
Right.
are things that I would say are probably not in people's best interest,
Right.
but
No
also
matter
what
what
I'm not
trauma's done to the body.
exactly, but what I'm not going to do is say, you know what, you're just a sinner. Go like
Right.
say five Hail Marys or whatever, or go pray
Right.
more, read more,
Yeah, cast your anxiety. Yeah, I mean, these are
Yeah.
great verses, but there's just a lot more nuance and complexity that when someone's experienced trauma. Like one thing you mentioned in your book is reenactments.
Hmm.
And as a trauma therapist as well, I really appreciated that because nobody's talking about that in the church. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit for listeners? They might go, "Oh my gosh, that's me."
Yeah. Yeah. We do things to try to figure out what happened to us and try to resolve it. You know, the
Mhm,
body keeps the score. And
mhm.
anytime someone says to me that, oh, it's just a matter of will. No, it isn't. We are
Right.
whole people. There is a component of will. There is a component of our thinky brains, and not just our feely
Mhm.
brains, right? We do want everything online. We're not just like making feely choices and not thinking them. But at the same time,
Oh, I want to
yeah,
record that and listen to that every morning.
yes.
Mm,
So when though we have these spaces of not knowing what to do because something happens, maybe it happened when we were very young, or it happened so repeatedly and so egregiously that we just are trying to figure it out, that
mhm,
we may go and do something outside of our values that is an attempt to resolve the trauma
mhm,
itself. So,
mhm,
for an example I give in Body and Soul Healed and Whole is that you walk into a bar and maybe you had been raped by someone, and you
mhm,
walk into a bar and then you start going home with guys, but not sleeping with them. Or even maybe sometimes you do sleep with them, but you want to make sure you have the control and the choice. This
mhm.
isn't a conscious thing. You're not like, this is what I'm going to do to attempt to resolve the trauma that is
Right,
residing in my
right,
body.
right,
It is this urge that you can't quite understand, and then shame
right,
follows behind because you're like, what is wrong with me?
right.
And the better question is, what happened to you?
Mhm, mhm.
And really going at that from that place, and then beginning to understand the behaviors themselves. Like, what are you trying to accomplish? And this is where a good trauma therapist who understands these dynamics can really help out, of
Yeah,
just helping
yeah.
you disentangle that and then make shifts. And so when you feel that, like, I need to go do this because I'm trying to fix this thing, you go, yeah, that doesn't fix the thing. It's
Mhm,
not going to
mhm,
fix being raped. It
mhm,
just doesn't. But I can surf the urge. I can
mhm,
do a number of things. I can notice what's happening in my body. I can
mhm.
honor my body's desire to resolve it, even though this is definitely not the best, healthiest, most
Right,
adaptive way,
right, right.
and really press into that. And those are places where when we stop just shaming people,
Mhm,
we open
mhm.
up to real healing. I've had many churches at times tell me, but you don't know what they're doing. And I'm like, oh, I do. They told me in my office.
Yeah,
But what I'm inviting them to is a different path.
right.
And as I invite them into that path, as we process the trauma in their bodies using
Mhm.
somatic interventions and things that are really that bottom up, your feely feelies to your thinky thinkies,
Yeah.
then we are going to have a much different outcome typically.
Yeah. And I love that. What happened to you? And I started to think about, and what did you not get to do
Yep.
in the middle of your
Yeah.
trauma? And that's the essence of reenactment is this constant trying to revisit it to be able to fight where you didn't get to, run away where you didn't get to,
Yep.
all these different
Have
somatic.
control.
Yes, yes. And so you also offer in the book, you get at it a little bit with like curses and vows and how trauma impacts our body, but what you're inviting them to instead. Can you highlight that in terms of some hopefulness for the listeners?
Yeah, when we talk about curses and vows, what we mean are when someone speaks something over you that is not what God says about you.
Hmm. Hmm.
In order to stay safe, we often will have to act as if that is true. And then we begin to believe that it is. And that's when we make a vow. I'm going to say this is true about me and walk from this place, because to not do so in an abuse situation is far too dangerous.
Hmm.
Then I believe that I am what is spoken over me. So if I am damaged goods or a whore or worthless, I
Hmm.
begin to say that is my identity instead of what God says about me, which is I am a daughter of a king. I'm a royal priesthood, a holy nation, which is a very different paradigm.
Right.
And until we start recognizing we have made vows and breaking them, then
Hmm.
it is very difficult to shift how we function in the
Hmm.
world. But when we say, I'm going to choose, and I'm going to say something that is simple, but it is always not easy. So,
Sure.
and
Sure.
as a fellow
I
therapist,
know.
simple,
Yes.
but not easy. It's like, wow, that's a really simple concept and really hard to do. But we start inviting ourselves to experience ourselves differently. That
Mm-hmm.
I am going to practice a little bit of opposite action. I'm going to act as if I believe I am the daughter of a king. I know
Mm-hmm.
that the Bible says it. I don't feel it because the lie feels very true.
Right.
But I am going to act as if it is true and I'm going to function in that way. So that means I might set a boundary in a relationship. I might end a relationship. I
Mm-hmm.
might decide not to walk into an enactment. I might do a lot of things differently.
Right.
And I'm going to invite my body into a different place because my body is not used to that. My
Mm-hmm.
brain is not used to that. And so we're building essentially resilience, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
you and I have talked about pendulation. We go in a little,
Yes.
out a little, in a
Mm-hmm.
little, out a little. And so we're going in a little to go, this feels really difficult and really hard, even though I know it's a simple concept. And I'm going to go in a little and try this. And then I'm going to come out a little and breathe and go, okay, that's what I did today. And then I'm going to keep doing it. And eventually it becomes how we function. And
Right.
those neural
Yeah.
pathways build, and through the Holy Spirit in us, we start to believe what the Lord says because we're also experiencing ourselves differently. A lot of times, especially for folks who've been deeply abused, we find that they really almost come home to themselves
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
start to see who it is that the Lord created them to be. And it is beautiful.
Yeah. You offer so much hope in this book. I know we're not even touching on all the different topics that you cover in there, but I did want to talk about one more topic if we have some time. Um,
Absolutely.
okay, because you do talk a little bit about, which I think is just mind-blowing information, is arousal templates and how people can create these templates in their body that get connected to things that they were never obviously meant to connect to, but that reoccurs in their body when it's referencing sex or anything that's sexual. Can you talk a little bit about that, what that is, and then how it shows up for a lot of people?
Absolutely. So let's talk about what an arousal template is. I don't
Right.
know if anybody who's listening, besides like you and I at this point, have thought about what turns me on and why. How did
Mhm.
I get
Right.
there?
Right.
And that is a great question because we all have an arousal template.
Hmm.
And we have them outside of just sex, and we talk about that in Body and Soul Healed and Whole. But we also have them related to sex. So how do we get these things woven together that have us having these sexual feelings?
Right.
And when it has been woven in with harm and violence,
Hmm.
we might find ourselves drawn to those things. We may find ourselves drawn to violence and sex. We want it, quote unquote, rough in some way. We want to feel physical pain with it
Hmm.
because that is a turn on, because that
Hmm.
was woven in during our harm. And so, what fires together wires together. So, if you have an
Hmm.
orgasm in the midst of harm and it happens enough times with some
Hmm.
other elements, we start to become drawn to that. And
Right.
that can really mess people up because when they get out of harm, they're like, why do I still feel this way? Why
Mm-hmm.
am I drawn to pornography? Why do I need these things to feel arousal? And it's because it got woven into the arousal template.
Mm-hmm.
And we can disentangle that. So if you're sitting there going, well, that explains a few things that I've never wanted to say out loud, now you
Yes,
know.
it's so powerful for people.
Yeah. And there's a way out. And that's the pieces you're like, man, this isn't what I
Yeah.
want it to stay with. And we can, there are things you can do.
Yeah. What are some last hopeful words you'd like to offer to someone who just stumbled across this and they're like, wow, that's me? What would you like to offer to them as an encouragement moving forward? Obviously, to get the book for sure and read it. I think you are such a smart, very smart person who has a lot of acronyms behind your name. So, this is a very well done book. I'll just say that as a little caveat. Now it's your turn.
I will say that whether you're married or single, there are things here for you. I know
Hmm.
that my single sisters often are overlooked and say, well, I can't even talk about sex. I'm not allowed to have sex, talk about sex. And it's like, well, no,
Hmm.
you have sexual desires. We should actually talk about them. And if there's sexual brokenness, it can be healed, whether you are single or married. You do
Right.
not have to have a relationship. And
Right.
there are ways to wrestle with desire as a single woman that we talk about in the book and delve into because it's important.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that no matter where you are on your journey, and some folks may be listening to this and go, I don't even think I can say the S word out loud.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that is honestly where I started in my own story.
Yeah.
I remember in grad school taking a human sexuality class because I knew I couldn't say the words at that point in
Right.
time. And so that was like me going, Lord, help. And that was my first journey into being able to try to say these words out loud.
Yeah.
And then the Lord just did all kinds of healing. But it really was powerful to learn that it was okay to say the words. It was okay to
Mm-hmm.
talk about things. It was okay to question and ask the Lord some things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, no matter where you are in your journey, whether you're like, I'm not ready to talk about it, or you're like, I really need to talk about it, I think
Mm-hmm.
this book is for you.
Yeah, I love too in the book how you interweave lots of parts of your story. It's such a vulnerable act to do that. And I know that so many people will appreciate that because you are talking from like literal experience of walking this out. And I really appreciated that a lot. So, where can they get your book? It's coming out April 1st, right? So, go get it. It's a wonderful book. I've read it, and I'm thankful to get to interview you about it.
Thank you so much. And Body and Soul Healed and Whole is available at every retailer. So, whichever your retailer of choice is, your purveyor of book purchasing, you
Mm-hmm.
can get that book. And I have them all linked on the tabithawestbrook.com website. So, you can go to the Body and Soul page and it will all be right there for you. And I'll also link to it in our show notes. And I'm really excited that you got to interview me. It's a strange thing on your own podcast to be interviewed by someone else, but I can't think of anybody I'd rather have do it than
Yes,
you. So I'm really glad that we got to do that
I
together
am
today.
too. It's super fun.
Thank you for being here with me. And we will also have Colleen's information in the show notes because honestly, she's amazing and you should know her. So thanks for hanging out with me today. And I will see everybody on next week's Hey Tabi. Thanks for joining me for today's episode of Hey Tabi. If you're looking for a resource that I mentioned in the show and you want to check out the show notes, head on over to tabithawestbrook.com/Hey Tabi. That's HEYTABI, and you can grab it there. I look forward to seeing you next time.